I grew up in a small coal town in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a wonderful place for an outdoorsy kid like myself. We had no immediate neighbors and acres of forest to play in. Above our house was a ridge that ran along the border of a state park, but all the trails and public areas were far in the valley below, separated by a thick forest, and there was plenty of no trespassing signs, so it was rare to have hikers crossing into our land. From our house, there was a dirt road that wound up the mountainside to the top of the ridge, where there stood the remains of a burnt-down cabin. From there, you could follow that ridge to a flat area popular with the local hunters, my dad and a few of his friends. One of them posted a trail cam during the off-season to monitor the wildlife. We had coyotes, the occasional bear, mountain lions that the DEP still refused to acknowledge, bobcats, and a lot of deer. Continuing up that ridge, you would get to a clearing that had lots of flat boulders and a giant electrical tower that was fun to climb on. I would venture up there every so often with our family's black lab, Felicia, and spend hours reading, climbing, and generally enjoying the outdoors. One early fall day when I was around 13, I headed up there with a backpack full of snacks and a book. I had taken care to avoid the trail cam, as it was one of those old film ones, and I had gotten into trouble before for inadvertently filling the entire rolls of film goofing off around that area. I reached my favorite rock at the edge of the clearing, near the power lines, and had just settled down to read, when Felicia began barking and growling, rather aggressively. At first, I paid it no mind, as she loved chasing deer, but this time she didn't bound off into the forest. Instead, she stayed next to me, growling at something unseen in the thick tangle of brush and trees. Now, I had considered hiking down that way before, as the park was in that direction, but it wasn't an easy passage. The area had been cleared years before to install the electrical tower. Once construction was complete, a thick mass of briars and weeds cropped up. The rocks that made for great climbing to the top of the ridge became difficult obstacles on the steep slopes below. Not to mention there was a much easier access closer to the park's entrance. This way brought you down to an undeveloped area at the very back of the campgrounds that wasn't easily accessible to cars or hikers. So I was taken off guard to see someone fighting his way through the brush from that direction. Nervously, I called out, "Hello?" and gripped Felicia's collar. She had a tendency to jump on people when she got excited, and I didn't want her to cause him to tumble down the mountain. I overheard my parents arguing about lawsuits when she barreled into a jogger on the trail. The man looked up and smiled at me, and extracted himself from the thorns and made his way up the hill to the base of my rock. I don't know if it was Felicia's reaction to him, or the rather remote and impassable way he had come from, but his presence made me feel uneasy. He was probably in his mid to late 20s, average height and build, rather unremarkable looking. No backpack or supplies, but he was wearing hiker attire. I didn't like the way he looked at me, although at my young age I couldn't place why exactly it unsettled me. But now as a grown woman, I can look back and realize that he was sizing me up. From his smile, he seemed to be pleased at what he saw. "Hi there, where did you come from?" He had no trace of an accent, which struck me as odd. Our area has a pretty strong regional accent, and we don't get a lot of outsiders. "I live just down the hill. I was hiking with my dog." "Oh, she seems like a nice dog," he told me, with no trace of irony. Felicia was snarling at him, but he seemed unconcerned. "You should have a leash on her, though. Wouldn't want to get into trouble with the park." "We put a leash on her when we're down in the park. This part is our property." There was no reaction from him learning that he was essentially trespassing. "Still, you're so close. You don't know who might come this way. No one from the park comes here, I told him. I was being a bit rude, but I was annoyed at some stranger telling me what to do with my dog on my property. I'm from the park. I'm one of the rangers, and I wanted to see the property. What would you have done if she had attacked me? You could get into big trouble. A chill crawled up my spine. We had only one ranger, and he was a close friend of the family. This man was definitely not him. But I was afraid to let on that I knew he was lying. I dug out Felicia's leash and clipped her, then stood up, slinging my backpack on. Sorry, I'll let you get on with your hike. I have to go home now. Your parents know you're up here? Oh yeah, they expect me home soon. Do they come up here often? I improvised on a whim. My dad does. He comes up and checks on the trail cams. This was the first time I saw the stranger's smile falter. Trail cams? Yeah, there's lots of them up here. He and his friends like to go hunting. The smile returned, but it was cold this time. Well, these would make excellent hunting grounds. He took a step toward me, and Felicia lunged, nearly yanking the leash right out of my hands. I managed to haul her back in time to keep her from tearing this man's smile right off of his face, but he didn't so much as flinch. You should head back now. Keep a tight hold on that leash. Maybe I'll see you up here again sometime. Yeah, maybe, I said, secretly thinking to myself that I'd never step foot into the woods again. Well, bye now. I quickly dragged Felicia away, looking back over my shoulder every now and then. He remained motionless in the spot where I had left him, staring at me with that same fucking smile. Once he was out of sight, I picked up the pace. Felicia kept growling over her shoulder, and occasionally, I would hear branches snapping behind me. I saw no sign of anyone following. I cut straight across the clearing with the trail cam, not bothering to avoid it in my rush to get away from the stranger. Once we hit the road that led home, I unclipped Felicia from her leash and broke into a jog. She remained by my side until I got back home. I didn't mention the strange man to my parents at first. They were weary about me hiking alone, and I didn't want them to forbid it. Furthermore, by the time I had gotten back, I had convinced myself that I was overreacting about the whole thing. He was probably just some hiker, and made up a story about him being a ranger to fuck with me, since I was giving him an attitude. Still, I didn't hike back up to that ridge that week, and instead snuck into the woods below my house. At the end of the week, I came home from school to a pissed-off dad, demanding to know if I had messed with the trail cam. One of his friends had come up to collect the film and discovered that the cam had been switched off with only a few frames taken. At first, I was only concerned with getting into trouble and desperately proclaimed my innocence. I then remembered the stranger. After telling my dad about him, he called the park ranger to ask if they had somebody new on board that we didn't know about. The ranger said no, but after hearing my story, he told my dad the campground attendant had caught someone overnighting in an unauthorized area back in the campgrounds the previous weekend. He had assumed the guy was just trying to get out of paying for a camping fee. He was described as a younger man, average-looking, very friendly, and apologized for what he said was a mistake, and took off. Shortly afterward, we heard from my dad's friend about the trail cam. He had gotten the role developed, and even though there was only a few frames, the last one was of me and Felicia cutting across the clearing. I thank God that I had told the stranger that there were multiple cams. I imagine he gave up once he couldn't locate the other ones. My parents have since moved to a small neighborhood down in the valley, and I've since moved out of town. In my parents' backyard, on the riverbank, there's a mound covered by Easter lilies that marks Felicia's final resting place. The house I grew up in fell into a state of disrepair after we left and was eventually burned to the ground. No one lives on that property now, but the clearing at the top of the hill is still popular with hunters. Whenever I visit that area for the holidays, I still like to hike up to that ridge, but when I do, I make sure to wave at all the trail cams, and I always bring a dog with me. I am a biologist, and I am frequently by myself in remote locations. This occurred when I was 26, somewhere between green and seasoned. I was surveying wetlands in a remote area of the Appalachians, in a terrain dominated by thick pine trees. Before setting out, I always go on the county assessor site and print off a map with landowner information so I wouldn't be trespassing. Out here, you'll be shot. At this particular site, there was a private driveway going through U.S. Forest Service land that would allow me to get to my area a bit quicker. To be clear, this driveway was absolutely public property. At no point did I trespass. I got to this road and pulled off to the side about 30 yards from a privacy entry gate. My car was clearly marked as a government vehicle. The forest is old-growth pine, but the outer edges of the forest is a thick undergrowth, forming a kind of wall before you got to the tree line with a nice open understory. I was about 200 yards in when nature called. I make like a bear in the woods and do my business. Wasn't my first rodeo. Midway through, I hear somebody yelling at my truck. Great, now I have to deal with this, I thought to myself. As I was getting ready to walk back, I heard gunshots. I stopped walking. Yeah, I'm not heading back to that. I stood there for about a minute considering my options, when I heard someone coming through the undergrowth on the edge of the forest. Shit, they're coming into the woods. Again, let me be clear. This was all public property. But at the same time, this is also absolutely the kind of area where people straight up disappear, and they have before. It is extremely remote, and the communities are very closed off to outsiders. This county has more than double the amount of game wardens of any other county in the state, and for good reason. I take off into a jog, using my sense of direction to make it out to the main road, about 600 yards away. More gunshots rang out in my direction. There was no way that whoever it was saw me, but perhaps they heard me. My adrenaline kicks into 100% now, and I'm moving with a mix of terror and urgency, trying to get back to the main road. I eventually reach my destination and hide under a nearby bridge. I call up a colleague and give him details of where I'm at, so that they can at least find my body. I then call 911. This was the first time in my life that I had to call 911 while on a job. The operator sounded skeptical over the phone, but eventually I got in touch with a deputy, and he didn't seem to believe me. They're probably just shooting at tin cans. Pfft, bullshit. It's Saturday night, 7 p.m., and he was just too lazy to get off his ass. I move further away into a public hunting area, and I eventually get stopped by a game warden. I explain the situation to him, and thank God he took me seriously. A few locals walked by us and commented about how that landowner is an asshole. He was from Louisiana, so he wasn't from around there, which explained a lot. I usually got along well with the locals that I had encountered, so this makes more sense. After an hour, the deputy gives me a ride back to my state vehicle. When we got there, we see somebody on an AVT, parked with a rifle across his lap, waiting for me in the dark. The deputy and I get out of the car, and I just walk straight to my truck and leave. At this point, it was 9 p.m., and I have a 4-hour drive back home. At the time, I didn't want to talk to the guy, but now I wish I had. Who knows how that conversation between the deputy and him went. I quietly started carrying a firearm with me in the field at all times. I'm glad I trusted my gut feeling that day and insisted on a police escort back to my vehicle. That was not an encounter I wanted to have with somebody with an overactive trigger finger. I had all the guy's contact information and thought about mailing him a map clearly stating where his property begins and ends, but something tells me that wouldn't matter, so I just let it go. Maybe he thought I was the creep. My girlfriend and I have hiked several parts of the Appalachian Trail. A few years back, we decided to give the southern portion of the Virginia's Trail a shot. It is about 166 miles long and runs through the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests from Roanoke County to Giles County. This is definitely one of the more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail. We planned our trip to end at Damascus and figured that by the time we got there, we would be more than ready to go home to our own beds. It was early October, and the changing of the leaves and colors were amazing. The air was cool and crisp, perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike. But our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you were supposed to camp just off of the trail or a designated shelter. We really didn't want to run into other people and didn't want anyone to come up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore those suggestions and find our own spot off the trail. After searching around, we found a spot a little ways off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, and talked for a while, before snuggling up together and calling it a night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was awoken by my girlfriend shaking me. "Get your gun. Someone is walking around outside of our tent." She informed me that she had woken up to somebody just outside, running a knife along the side of our tent as they were circling us. Whenever we go hiking, I always bring my 1911 and my judge with me. You never exactly know who or what you might run into on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my pack, and we sat silently, listening for any sounds. After a few minutes of listening to nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, we heard it. Someone or something was walking through the forest behind our tent. I got a flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. At this time, our fire had gone out, and it was nearly pitch black. The only illumination came from the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I went to go check things out. I didn't flick on the flashlight right away to not give away my position, or that I was outside of the tent, and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited for more noises. After a few minutes, it sounded like it was bipedal based on the way the steps were placed. I turned on the flashlight and scanned the area. I thought I saw someone moving behind a tree. I yelled out and told him to go away and that I was armed. I kept my beam fixated on that area with my gun drawn and slowly approached to where I thought I saw the figure. Then from my right, I heard the sounds of someone running away through the forest. I spun to face my light that way. Then suddenly, from the original spot, who or whatever was there had taken off into the forest as well. There was no way that I was giving chase, so I returned to the campsite I tell my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up standing guard outside of the tent in the darkness until daybreak. The following morning, I look around a while for signs of who or whatever it was, and discovered a boot print in the soft, moist dirt, not far from where our tent was. It wasn't mine or my girlfriend's. This freaked me out, as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one person, was stalking around our tent in the dark. I kept this revelation to myself because I didn't want to freak out my girlfriend any more than she already was. We were pretty deep in, and we still had 2 days left. That day we walked a little faster and covered as much ground as we possibly could. When it came time to set up camp, we found a spot near a cliff where we could place a tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The entire day up to this point, I had a feeling that we were being followed. There was no confirmation of this. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else. It was more of just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some dinner. Then after a while, we again retreated into the tent. I gave my girlfriend the 1911, and I kept the judge right next to me. I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep, and I stayed awake, listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours, just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, my own exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted off. I awoke some time later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, quickly motioning for her to stay quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see the outline of someone's shadow against our tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled at them something along the lines of, "We're armed. Get the fuck out of here." They stopped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, my gun drawn and ready to shoot at someone. Our stuff was everywhere. I walked to the edge of the woods, in the direction they had taken off to. There was a creek nearby, and a small trail alongside it. Down the creek, I could see a light. It looked like a lantern by the way it flickered. Then I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the creek. I told my girlfriend that we had to start packing up, and that we were leaving now. We packed up everything of value, leaving the tent and a few other items, then headed back onto the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing voices somewhere off in the forest, and branches snapping. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure that nobody was there. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anywhere, and quite literally on our own. Since we hadn't seen another hiker this entire time, I felt that we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. We rounded a corner, and I turned around and saw somebody step out onto the trail and just stand there, watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up, and there was barely any light. I couldn't make out any of their features, just a shadow. I stopped and looked at them for a second, and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently, watching us, and then turned and disappeared back into the forest. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut feeling told me that they were still there. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car. We were extremely exhausted. We had made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the entire time. I have no idea who those people were or what they wanted. Maybe it was just somebody messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies who were hunting us. We will never truly know, and I will not be returning to find out.